Before you listen to the podcast, I want to ask for your input. Teagasc have launched a survey to help identify the impacts of the very wet autumn. The loss of winter crop area will be compounded by a lack of seed for spring cereals, which may lead to unsown land on many farms in 2024. Teagasc are asking all tillage farmers to participate in the survey to tell us how much land which was destined for spring crops is still unsown and your intentions for this area in 2024. The link to the survey is in the show notes.
The overall message from the harvest hasn't been good, but there have been individuals who actually have done quite well this year, and they will tell you on the quiet that they have done reasonably okay. They tend to be the people who spread risk across their farm, whether it be the rotation, whether it be a spread of crops, spreads workload over a bigger period of time. Those people generally tended to get on reasonably okay, albeit all the other factors that were out there. They seem to get work done.
As the end of the year approaches, most tillage farmers will want to forget 2023. Unfortunately, it will be a year which will be remembered for some time for its weather extremes and the resulting difficulties for tillage farmers. Generally, it's beneficial to look back at how we dealt with the year, and if it would run again, would there have been any decisions we would have made differently? You are listening to the latest episode of The Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. In 2023, the cropping season from October right through to the following September was difficult for all tillage farmers. I just wonder, is this a once-off or will this be closer to the new norm? To chat about this year, I'm delighted to be joined by Ciaran and Shay Phelan, both tillage specialists in Teagasc, to review the 2023 cropping year and see if there's any lessons here for 2024. Shay, it was a really strange year weather-wise. Maybe you can bring us through the highs and lows of the weather over the past 12 months.
Yeah, Michael, you're right. It's been a particularly peculiar year, I suppose, weather-wise for a lot of people. And people probably remember the storms, Ciaran and Babette, towards the tail end of it. But it's been a trend throughout the year. We started off probably with a pretty normal January. Sorry, I should go back probably to the autumn of last year when it was difficult to actually plant crops. And people kind of sometimes forget that autumn 2022, particularly November, was very, very wet. So it was difficult to plant crops. So winter crops came into the season probably on the back foot. And all right, we had a pretty benign sort of January, according to sort of a normal January. February, the start of February was quite wet, but the second half of February was actually quite dry. And that helped to kind of catch up on some of the work that needs to be done in terms of maybe planting some of those winter varieties that still need to be planted or drilling some of the spring crops as well. So the end of February kind of gave that little bit of time for people to do that. And then I suppose if you take March and April, we're well above average in terms of overall rainfall. So that delayed work for those crops in there. So things like getting out herbicides, nitrogen, so on and so forth, they were delayed in that March and April period because people couldn't travel. April kind of dried up towards the end of it and allowed a little bit of work to be done on those winter crops. And in May, then we ran into a drought. And I suppose that really put crops on the back foot because some of them were in poor enough conditions coming through the winter. Root structure mightn't have been brilliant on them. And some of them really did suffer in that late May, early June drought that they got. And I suppose then the tail really after that is of the wet weather. And that really had a very bad impact on crops later in the season, especially winter crops and as well as spring crops as well. And that really delayed harvesting. And we found, winter barley harvest, straw lying in the ground for 6, 7, 8 weeks, people not being able to get that straw off the ground. It was a very stop-start harvest for all those crops all the way into, and it lasted up until October, unfortunately. So it's been a very, very tough year on tillage crops and on tillage farmers in general. And unfortunately, it's having a knock-on effect into 2024 in that we're seeing plantings now under pressure and crops that have been planted in the autumn of this year under pressure and a lot of bare patches and what have you, similar to last year. So that's unfortunately going to have an impact for 2024 as well. So overall, in a quick summary, it's been a very, very tough year on tillage farms.
Okay, thanks, Shay. Ciaran, just bringing you in there. I mean, there's a lot of extremes there outlined by Shay. All the way from the autumn plantings in 22 coming into 23. I think farmers in the south were probably more adversely affected by that weather around their cropping plans. Would that be true?
Yeah, I think so, Michael. I was just looking at winter barley there, and like I just picked Cork and Wexford as sort of two counties in the southern half. Like, and if you compare 23 with the previous year and 22, the winter barley area in Cork dropped by 41%, and in Wexford it dropped by 45%. So I think there was certainly seemed to be more that rainfall concentrated in the south. Now I suppose on the back of that, the tail end of the harvest and for sowing oilseed rape was actually quite good because, the rape area was a record, was a 20 odd thousand hectares, but certainly any winter barley that was sown in that sort of early October slot, and we pretty much ran out of road after that. In the wheat, look, obviously the same applies. However, as Shay just said there, look, there was a small bit of catch up done in maybe old bits in December and the early part of the spring there, which kind of brought the wheat area still back, but kind of getting towards near normal in the south. So I think the winter barley, Michael, was the one that really took the biggest hit.
So then, Ciaran, I suppose in terms of it's, I suppose getting crops planted in that really tricky back end down your part of the world was one thing, but how did they actually come through the winter into the spring? Were they under pressure?
Well, surprisingly enough, and back to winter barley, they actually came through not too bad. And I think some of the reason for that was that any of the winter barley that was sown, I'm just concentrating on winter barley for a minute, was sown sort of early enough. So it did get that chance into good conditions as well, by and large. It did get that chance to develop and sort of withstood the worst of the weather. So I think well, look, certainly there were bare patches here and there, and it had an effect, but maybe not as bad as maybe you might have expected, we'll say.
And Shay, then in terms of those winter crops, they were looking probably okay, maybe further up the country, maybe they weren't too bad, I suppose, really. But February was a very dry month. I think it's only about 37% of normal rainfall, which was for February extremely dry. How did farmers utilize that time on farm?
As you say, Michael, it was very dry, and I suppose they used it in a couple of different ways. One was to catch up on some of the winter plantings that maybe didn't happen, and drilling some of those winter wheat varieties. I suppose a lot of people used it to start drilling crops like beans, and we would have seen bean acreage rise this year. So a lot of people would have used that dry period at that time to drill those crops and to sow spring barley. There's quite a bit of malting barley sown around that time as well. And that was probably what they concentrated on. It was probably really only a 2 week window where they actually could do that work, because obviously ground had to dry out that little bit from all the rain that had got over the winter time. So there was quite a bit of tillage work actually went on in that last 2 weeks of February. And I suppose some of the Ciaran mentioned there winter barley, some of the guys who had got a bit who normally travel and go early on winter barley got a bit of fertilizer on that winter barley early, and that seemed to make a big difference in crops later on in the season. Those crops that got that early nitrogen towards the last couple of days of February when they could travel, that seemed to give them that kind of boost and got them to grow and kept tiller numbers alive. Whereas some people who didn't get to put out fertilizer that time had to wait until the end of March, and some cases even to April, to get nitrogen on crops. And yield was already lost in winter barley by the time they got the nitrogen out. So there was a lot of work went on in that 2 week window, I suppose, that towards the end of February, and it did have a big impact on crops later on in the season.
Okay. And Ciaran, as February rolled by and we ended up into March, I think in some farmers, I heard a commentary about, February is just a bit too early for me in terms of planting crops. I think I'll wait out to March. But March didn't really turn out the way people would have liked, given the fact that Met Éireann is telling us is one of the wettest Marches on record. How did farmers cope with that?
Yeah, like as you say, March is a crucial one for, I suppose, especially for spring barley. Really, if March comes right, you're in time, and if you get good conditions, you're away. And like Shay said, down my side of the world, February was useful because, in fairness, there was a lot of beans sown in February. I would say the vast majority, and sown in relatively good conditions. Although some of the ones that were sown toward their end of February, early March, they did suffer a bit, especially maybe some of the direct drill systems and that. And we did see a few incidents where where they got wet after, and there was some bad results. But in general, now, in fairness, I think February was kind to beans in that sense and helped get the area up. There was some barley planted in that late February, early March slot. I'm thinking of kind of traditional spring barley areas, maybe East Cork, maybe up around Enniscorthy, like Shay said, those kind of malting barley areas as well. Now, albeit it was a small end of it, and they were the ones that actually yielded best after, in fairness. So there was that little bit of work done there, but then following up, as you say, March was just very, very difficult. There was very little planting done in March, if any, really, and then it had the knock-on effect then of not being able to get into the winter crops on time with fertilizer.
Yeah. And speaking about fertilizer, Shay, I suppose it's hard to forget, but I suppose memories can be short when you're looking at a shock. But the huge amount of the fertilizer that was bought had to be bought around then, but it was very expensive.
Yeah, you're right, Michael. I mean, nitrogen, depending on what you were buying, whether it be urea or can or protected urea, whatever you were buying, it was, it was 800-900 euros, maybe even €1,000 a ton. And that actually had a bit of that caused a bit of a problem as well, in that some farmers who probably weren't organized, and especially thinking about winter barley, who were delaying buying fertilizers and delaying waiting to see if prices were going to drop. Some of those farmers missed that window of opportunity to spread a bit of nitrogen on winter barley crops there towards the end of February, and that really did have a huge impact on the crop thereafter. But again, I mean, there was all talks at the time of fertilizer being scarce and being difficult to get, and people were just holding out, hoping that there would be a drop in price on that fertilizer. But the drop in price came far too late for tillage farmers. It didn't really happen until the tail end of the spring and early summer. And I suppose that expensive fertilizer did cause that issue on winter barley crops this year.
Okay, and talking about being late, then there was March threw everything into a bit of a disarray, and people were sowing all the way into March. But how late did the spring plantings finish, Shay?
Yeah, I suppose, Michael, that's the big problem, the big story of the year, really, I suppose, in terms of people really only got drilling after that 2-week period in February and early March, first couple of days of March. They really didn't get back drilling until late April. Mid to late April, depending on the soils we're in some of the lighter soils, as Ciaran said, maybe down in Wexford, East Cork, the kind of Barrow Valley, if you like, people were able to get back in mid-April. But on some of the heavier soils up around Meath, Dublin, they didn't get in really until the end of April. And they drilled all the way through till the end of May, and in 1 or 2 cases were drilling up until June. So it really did set the stall for the crops for the rest of the season, and really put a limit on their capacity to produce yield. So it really was a difficult spring to get crops in.
And Shay, just a last word, maybe a quick word on potatoes. Were they as affected? Were they being planted all the way through May or into June?
They were, of course, Michael. And again, I suppose there was even more severe in a potato situation, because really with potatoes, you have to let the ground or the soil dry at depth, because you're going down that 12 to 18 inches to try and get soil up to form beds and whatever. So I know some guys got panicked and started drilling up in late April, when really conditions weren't really suitable. And some of those became problematic after, because they got really dry in the drought period, and drills started to crack and get very, very difficult to work, and they opened up as well. But the guys who finished off the planting probably in the end of May and into early June, they planted in the best conditions, and some of those were the best crops that we had.
Okay. And Ciaran, the weather kind of changed a little bit, and really is a year of weather, I suppose, really, but it changed to another extreme in May. There was only about 60% of the normal rainfall in May, of which again was really warm as well. And that spilled over into June, certainly the first half, or maybe right up to maybe the 3rd week of June, was very warm as well, and very dry. Did that hinder any of those late sown spring crops? Because I presume at that stage there was probably a little bit of drought stress maybe coming on them.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And like we said earlier, small bit of planting done in the early part of the spring, we'll call it. There was some then done around, say, that Easter time, And then as Shay said there, look, you were running into near the end of April then for a lot of it, and heavier soils, it ran later again. So the earlier crops, while it was dry in May and June, the earlier crops were absolutely fine. They had a good root structure developed, and I didn't really see any great issues there. But certainly the later sown crops, absolutely huge issues. Probably more of an issue the further up you went in the country, because I suppose, look, you were sowing that little bit later. So that was a big factor in spring barley yield. And I know when we were looking at spring barley yield for the harvest report, and that, like, I don't think I've ever seen such a broad range of yields. You had from crops doing 3.25 and better in some of those earlier ones, and then we were below 2 ton in some of those later ones. And I think really that late sowing and that combination, obviously, then of that dry weather May and June would have been the big factors there, really. I suppose the other, if there's a benefit, then I suppose that dry weather May and June are key months in the development of winter crops, and I certainly think disease pressure was much lower this year than normal. So I suppose that was an advantage for some of the winter cereals, especially.
Right. And Shay, I suppose from the point of view of harvest wasn't too far away then at the end of June. It's the first time in a long time that many farmers, maybe even around here in Carlow, and that they actually started their harvest in June rather than in July as normally would have been. How did the harvest progress from there?
It started exceedingly early, and in actual fact, we probably started ahead in certain places and certain farms ahead of the guys in Cork, which is normally, it's very unusual. Normally it starts in Cork first and then works its way up the country. This year it started around some of those lighter soils around the Midlands, and then some of the better crops down in Cork came on board then. And I suppose from that first week of July all the way through to the end of the harvest, which unfortunately, as I said before, for the most of it ended up in October, albeit there's some still to be harvested or remains unharvested. But it really was dragged out. If we take winter barley, for example, people started cutting that first week of July, and it was a stop-start. You get a day here, then it rained, then you get and maybe a day's drying, then you go again. And it was kind of that sort of pattern all the way through. It was maybe 1 or 2 days cutting a week, then you got rain for the rest of the week, and then you go the following week, you get another day or two's cutting. And that progressed literally all the way through the harvest, and it became very, very difficult, I would say, in a lot of cases, to round up straw. Albeit we got a week or two window around the end of August, early September, when we had the crops forum, which was a very dry week, and that facilitated a lot of that straw to be gathered up and baled and so on and so forth. But I suppose on top of that stop-start harvest, I mean, we were looking at crops that we knew there wasn't as good a yield potential in. Like, look at some of those winter barley crops. Like I said, they didn't get that early fertilizer, so tillers were dropped. So you're looking at crops that had maybe 800 heads per square meter, where we should have been looking at maybe 1,000 or 1,100. So the yield potential wasn't in them. And likewise with spring barley crops, some of those crops, I mean, the late sown crops, there was only one tiller on a lot of those plants. And you could see from the combine, you could see down to the ground. There wasn't a mat of heads coming in. So it really, really was a difficult harvest, both in terms of trying to get the work done, but also in terms of what was in front of you in the combine. It was in a lot of cases very, very poor.
And in terms of the average yield, Shay, how did those end up for the bulk of the harvest stuff? I suppose that was done up until the end of August.
Yeah, I suppose if we take winter barley, Michael, there was, I suppose, if you look at the overall average, it was about 8.7 tons a hectare, which is, it's below average. But I suppose that there's a huge, as Ciaran said, there's a huge range within that. There was some crops doing over 4 tons, and there was some crops doing as low as 2 tons. And there was huge problems within that as well in terms of bushels and stuff like that. It was just, one of those years where you didn't know what you were going to get from one field to the next. One field could be fine, the next field you go into a completely different crop in it. So it was really, really difficult to gauge yields in terms of what were averages around the place. Like I say, those earlier ones, some of them were very, very poor. Then we got into good crops. Then we got into poor crops again. So it was very, very difficult to figure out what way average yields were going to be throughout the season.
In terms of one crop versus the other, was there any particular crop that was better, I suppose, or it performed particularly reasonably well in comparison to others across the year, across the farms or the crops that were on farms?
There's no real standout. I mean, all the crops, I suppose, if you like, Michael, they were below what they would have had, what we would have seen in other years. It just depends on the site, the location, when it was sown. Winter oilseed rape, probably people would have been reasonably happy with it, apart from the price, compared to 2022. But in general, I would say if you were to take a general broad range over the whole lot of them, some of those early sown spring barley crops did quite well actually, and some of those malt and barley crops that were sown in February, they did quite well. But if you take the overall average and bring in what was harvested at the end of the season, some of those crops were quite poor. So it brings down the overall average. So it's difficult to say that one crop, there's normally one crop in the harvest where you say, yeah, that did well this year. There didn't seem to be that this year. They were all kind of, one was less worse than the other.
So I presume the hangover with that then, Shay, is you have the margins for farmers for 2022 are very much down an awful lot in comparison to last year, obviously, but maybe down in comparison to average. But also there's a hangover there in terms of straw volumes that are available for sale or have been sold out there.
Yeah, and that's a very important point, Michael, because a lot of people, the Strong Corporation measure this year was well subscribed by the farmers because they looked at those later sown crops, and for a variety of reasons, they decided, well, listen, these crops probably aren't going to produce a huge amount of straw, or they're going to be late harvested. So they chopped a lot of straw this year, and it chopped a lot of bad straw, which probably wouldn't have amounted to a whole amount anyway. But that has left straw volumes around the country in very short at the moment, and we're seeing straw coming in from the UK at the moment to try and fill that gap, which is not ideal. But I suppose it's just another symptom of the year. And I'm not even confident, Michael, if even if the straw chopping scheme wasn't there, given the rainfall that we had, given the crops that we had, whether there would have been enough straw in the country anyway to meet the market that was there.
Yeah, difficult year. And Ciaran, talking about difficult year to end off, so you had a number of sorry. So Ciaran, talking about the end of the year and sort of the end of the harvest, you had a number of farmers who didn't get to harvest their crops. Was there many of those in the end up?
I suppose it's hard to gauge, Michael. I just saw a report the other day that there was 277 applications for the unharvested crop scheme that the department had. Now, if you took that everybody put in the max, that'd be 5,500 hectares. So look, some industry reports are saying maybe in around 4,000. But I suppose that doesn't really tell the full story because, there's certainly a lot of crops out there where farmers, did cut them, but they were absolutely bet with the weather, and they might have taken a ton and a half off them. So I suppose that's in that cycle there, or that, so look, it was a bitter one there at the end, certainly, Now look, the scheme will help some farmers, and that certainly would be welcomed,
And of course, that rolls on a little bit into the autumn planting, which again, Ciaran, has been really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you think you wouldn't get two in a row, but like we certainly have, it's probably even more difficult this year. I suppose, again, I mentioned the harvest report earlier on, and for that report, we, getting feedback from advisors, people in the trade, hard to put numbers on it, but certainly winter barley is the one that's taken the biggest hit again. Just weather conditions just haven't been suitable. I mean, we could be as low as 35,000 hectares. If you remember in 22, we were up at 74,000 hectares. So that's a massive hit there. The wheat one is a bit of a movable feast, because there's wheat, was going in even up to last week. So that certainly will improve a little bit, but we're probably looking at the lowest winter cereal area at the moment since probably 13, So that's kind of where we are with it at the minute. But as I say, look, the wheat one is moving still a little bit,
So just in terms of the overall year, lads, in terms of, was there a couple of lessons that you maybe took from the year? And maybe Ciaran, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I suppose, we're talking about climate change and that at the moment, and I suppose we're seeing the effects of it longer, wet and dry spells, and it's certainly having a big impact on crop production. And I suppose we're we're all the time scratching our heads. How do we mitigate this or reduce the risk? And I suppose the one thing that I would have seen during the year, I'm sure farmers did anyway, but like it's just that we just have to take every opportunity to plant once conditions are right. You sort of can't leave that planting window go, and if you do, you can get caught. So for argument's sake, if you had ground dry enough there in early March to sow barley, and you said, look, I'll wait, you were into April before you got that done. So I think the big thing for me is just, be ready, take the opportunity when it comes, if conditions are right. I think that's the big one for me this year, really.
And just to follow up on that one, does that necessarily mean that bigger machinery is required?
Look, I suppose you could argue that always, especially with harvest capacity. I mean, we're often criticised in Ireland for being over capacity. Now, just couldn't have enough capacity this year. But I think the follow on to that one is like that. If you don't get the winter area sown, or if you can't spread your crop risk, you're going to end up in a scenario. If you get a bad harvest, we'd say, for argument's sake, with a lot of spring barley to harvest. So again, it's sort of back to the first point of trying to take every opportunity. And I think really the only way we can mitigate that risk somehow is just having a broad range of crops. So maybe to use beans as an example. For those growers that put in a field or two of beans, well, that was a field or two that they didn't have to sow later in the spring that may in the past have been in spring barley. So that kind of took a bit of pressure off. So I think it's just having a broader range of crops that allows you to take up the planting opportunities when they come, whether that's autumn or spring.
Okay. And Shay, similar question to you in terms of, is there one or two takeaways that you brought from 2023?
Yeah, I'd echo Michael, what Ciaran said there about spreading your risk. And I think, we kind of, the overall message from the harvest hasn't been good, but there have been individuals who actually have done quite well this year, and they will tell you on the quiet that they have done reasonably okay. They tend to be the people who spread risk across their farm, whether it be the rotation, whether it be a spread of crops, and that takes workload, or spreads workload over a bigger period of time. Those people generally tended to get on reasonably okay, albeit all the other factors that were out there, they seem to get work done. And I suppose the other one that for me was a crucial one this year was not to be afraid to ask for help. And I think if you look at the harvest issue and look at the poor and fortunates who still have crops that still have to be harvested, or harvested very late crops, some of those people just didn't ask for help in time, and there was probably help out there if they'd gone to look for it in time. If I look at some of the really big efficient outfits out there, most of those farms got all the work done in time because they had help on hand at the time, whereas some of the people who didn't get the crops done in time, or didn't get them in time or get them out in time, they're people who try to do everything on their own. And that's kind of a critical message that I would have for the year, or learning that I would have for the year. If things are getting tight, just ask for help.
Okay, I think that's very sound advice, because I think a problem shared is a problem halved, as they say out there,
Exactly.
whether it's physical work or otherwise, because I think there might be a good few people out there this year certainly feeling a bit low after this year, because at the end of the day, and I think a lot of people who aren't involved in farming maybe forget about it, that the income from to those households comes from working with the land and working outdoors. Guys, look, that's all we have time for, and a really huge thanks to you for your contribution for this week, but also for your contribution through the entire year. It's been a pleasure for you joining us and giving the benefit of your wisdom and your observations about what's going on out there. Thanks, guys.
No problem,
Thanks,
Michael.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Shay and Ciaran for joining me on the podcast this week and for their contribution throughout the year. I want to wish you and your family a very happy and safe Christmas, and I will chat to you next Thursday, where we hear from Dr. Sarah Cook about blackgrass and how to control it on your farm. So finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, and recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice. Before I sign off, another gentle reminder to please fill out the survey. The details are in the show notes.